Shabbat Shalom. One very often hears people call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict complicated. This is for good reasons. There are many layers to understanding what's going on in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. When it comes to trying to understand the conflict, you have to try to understand conflicting narratives, ancient history, personal stories, a huge amount of information, naughty modern history, and often conflicting emotions. The dispute over this land is indeed complicated in the first sense of the term, meaning it involves many different and confusing aspects. And yet, people often mean something else when they say that the conflict is complicated. Sometimes people are referring it to how it is hard to solve. As the vice president of the Union for Reform Judaism for Israel, Josh Weinberg, put it, "It's complicated" can be used to express the fact that the greatest minds of several generations have tried to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and have failed. Speeches have been given, books and articles have been written, and yet we do not appear to be anywhere near the end of the conflict, nor is there an obvious path to this endpoint as so many desire. But there are yet more ways people use this term when they say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is complicated. Weinberg points out that people call the conflict complicated as a way of ending conversation sometimes. Weinberg writes, "The phrase can be used to placate and dismiss those with whom they disagree. There's no intention of diving into the complications, and these two words are polite-sounding way of saying, be quiet, or you just don't understand." As you can see, and maybe as you've thought about yourself, the ways we use the phrase, "it's complicated," when it comes to this conflict are complicated. But at the risk of adding yet another layer of complexity, I want to focus tonight on a different way I see this phrase used. When folks say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is complicated, I find that sometimes people are too comfortable with ending the conversation there. It's wrong to use the complexity of the conflict as a justification for inaction. If the conversation ends at "it's complicated," I think that puts us in a bad position. Parts of the conflict and parts of the situation we're in now are morally simple, actually, and even obvious. Some things that are normally associated with the pro-Israel side are simply true. It is simply true that all the hostages held in Gaza should be released immediately. It is simply true that the horrors committed on October 7th were unimaginable and wrong. It is simply true that anti-Semitism is always wrong. At the same time, some things normally associated with the pro-Palestinian side are also simply true. It is simply true that hundreds of thousands of Gazan civilians have been displaced and are living through a humanitarian crisis. It's simply true that at times the Israeli military has not done enough to limit civilian casualties in this war. It's simply true that this war has gone on for too long. It's simply true that the Israeli government has allowed settlers to harm Palestinians in the West Bank. It's simply true that the government's policies in favor of settlement expansion hurt the long-term cause of peace. The title of a popular textbook used in synagogues like ours is Israel: It's Complicated. Yes, Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are complicated, but I find that we as liberal Jews do ourselves a disservice when we say it's complicated and we leave it at that. My hope for us tonight, and especially for those of us who are younger and still in high school, is that we can delve into the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict while not losing sight of how some things that are going on are simply wrong. Our Torah portion this week, Pinchas, honors the importance of both moral complexity and moral simplicity through two stories. In the first story, 5 sisters see an example of injustice and speak out against it. When their father, a man named Slofchad, dies, the sisters realize that because of some unjust laws, they stand to inherit none of his land. So they come together and argue their case before Moses and God ultimately agrees with them and says that the law was unjust. So God changes the law. I see this story as a clear example of something being simply wrong and the good that can happen when we speak out against injustice. The second story is a little more naughty. Naughty with a K, not naughty in that way. In last week's Torah portion, we read about Pinchas, a zealous man who killed 2 people for breaking laws around mixed marriages. In a disturbing twist, God then celebrates Pinchas for taking the law into his own hands in our Torah portion this week. However, if we look closely at the text, the Torah also says that God grants Pinchas a brit shalom, a covenant of peace. This seems to be a subtle indication in the Torah itself that Pinchas's actions were a one-time thing that shouldn't be repeated. The rabbis who took inspiration from the Torah in developing Judaism took this idea and they ran with it. The rabbis were very skeptical of zealotry, of the idea that one person could come and get caught up in a frenzy and act ethically. Instead, the rabbis embraced complexity, debate, and the value of group conversation. Even though the story of Pinchas seems to be an example of zealotry, of believing that a situation is simple, our Jewish tradition sees this as a one-time occurrence. Instead, the rabbis celebrated disagreement and nuance. And so we have grounding in our tradition for both how to act when something is simply wrong and also how to be careful and to remind ourselves that we don't have all the answers ourselves. Where does this leave us in the current moment? It behooves all of us to learn as much as we can about the conflict, to study, to try to listen with an open mind to others' stories and perspectives. I recall a friend of mine in Israel once told me that no one lens can really explain the conflict. The lens of sociology applies, the lens of colonial history applies, the lens of regional conflict applies, the lens of racism applies, the lens of religious studies applies, and the list goes on. There are endless levels of complexity to the conflict. At the same time, just looking at Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit this week to the United States, one can point to some things that are simply wrong. Protesters in Washington, D.C. who carried a Hamas flag were acting immorally, and I'll add stupidly. At the same time, Netanyahu implying that everyone who protests his policies are one of Iran's, quote, useful idiots, I think that is also wrong. Yes, some of the protesters, like those who carried Hamas flags, were wrong and perhaps idiots, but most of the protesters were not thoughtless. For example, both Rabbi Joel Jacobs, the head of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, and Rabbi Josh Weinberg, the head of the Reform Movement's Israel arm, protested Netanyahu's visit, and they were on the streets of Washington doing so. In a blog post about Netanyahu's speech, Rabbi Jacobs, who is part of our In Focus Israel-Gaza series, highlighted some of what I see as the uncomplicated truths about the present situation. Rabbi Jacobs wrote, "We need not feed into the narrative that one must choose between false alternatives, that caring about Israelis means supporting the government's war, or that caring about Palestinians means vilifying Israelis and opposing the existence of Israel. We must insist loudly that there is another way. one that recognizes the dignity, human rights, safety, and self-determination of both Israelis and Palestinians. Indeed, the only way forward is to end the war with a deal that frees the hostages, brings respite to the sufferings of the Gazans, and moves towards a long-term diplomatic solution in which both Israelis and Palestinians can flourish. This leads to one of the most simple and also perhaps most true insights about the conflict. It doesn't have to be one side or the other. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. As Rabbi Jacobs articulates, the only way to peace, the only way to long-term security, is for us to go beyond thinking that one side has to win. Instead, the two main groups on the land between the river and the sea have to find a way to coexist. And so, to the young people here tonight, I encourage you to learn about the conflict, study it, listen to people you disagree with an open mind, perhaps even nerd out about the complexity of the region. And at the same time, don't lose sight of how some of what is happening is simply wrong. We all have to learn to hold both the simplicity and the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Shabbat Shalom.